With the clock already ticking on this session of Parliament, the pressure is on the government to pass legislation, including a long-promised landmark bill on Indigenous child welfare. But will it meet the looming deadline and the expectations of Indigenous groups? We heard from Cindy Blackstock earlier in the show about her concerns with the draft bill. The CBC's Jorge Barrera joins me now with more. Hey there, nice to see you again. Thanks for being with us. So outline for us, if you could, the main critiques of this draft bill.
So in late January, as part of this sort of ongoing months-long co-development consultation process between the federal government and Indigenous groups, federal officials presented a draft of this proposed bill to First Nations representatives on the Assembly of First Nations Legislative Working Group that has been focused on this, and this working group is made out of political and technical representatives. And the people I spoke to on the record couldn't get into the details of what they saw because they all have these confidential undertakings as part of this process. But they said that the main concerns that they had going in, or their main asks, still remain. And those are two major things, which is jurisdiction and funding. In terms of jurisdiction, they were hoping to see what was promised, which is enabling legislation, and legislation that basically affirms First Nations rights to run their own child welfare system. They don't want to see delegated authority, which basically means that they could only set up their own First Nations welfare structures under provincial or federal authority, where the federal government or provincial government, says yes, yeah, we can do this. They want something separate, which is what they believe was promised, where they set it up and then they tell the provinces or the federal government, this is what we're going to do. So they raised these concerns and then they relayed them back to federal officials who were there, and they were told, okay, we're going to listen to you. But the thing is that these issues aren't new. I know that in August, from the AFN side, there was a draft version of the law that was presented by the First Nations reps to Ottawa, saying this is sort of what we want to see. So it's not like federal officials didn't know that these are the main asks. So it's raised a lot of concerns as why, basically at the 11th hour, are these issues still there? And speaking of the 11th hour, back in December, I remember the Prime Minister told the Assembly of First Nations chiefs that the legislation would be introduced the last week of January, I think it was. Here we are in the first week of February. Mm-hmm. Talk a bit about the timeline and concerns over that right now. Well, the time crunch is on, right? There's only about 12 sitting weeks of Parliament left. It doesn't look like it's going to be tabled this week. That means there's an off week next week. So, I mean, the window is really closing. I mean, Minister O'Regan's office says we're going to table it shortly. We are going to incorporate all the things that have been raised by our partners. But, these are not new concerns. The other thing is that they really need to hit the mark on this, because this is a very sensitive issue. We're talking about children and rights. The Harper government tried to bring forward First Nations education, and that didn't go anywhere. And then this government tried to bring forward this rights and recognition framework, which is now shelved, which didn't get anywhere, which is one of three main pieces of legislation promised by this government. And the only one we've seen on the order paper is the Languages Act. But if they miss the mark and they table it anyway, if there's a substantial group or even some groups that say, you know what, this is not appropriate, they're going to resist it, and it's going to make it very difficult for this to get through. But the stakes are really high, right? Well, as you said, when the federal government announced this, November, Jane Philpott, the former minister for Indigenous Services, says, this is a turning point, breaking away from over a century of harmful First Nations federal policies directed at First Nations children, ranging from residential schools to the 60s scoop, and now with the high rates of children in care, Indigenous children in care. So the stakes are really, really high with this, and the promise is a big one. So, it's a cliche to say, well, time will tell. Well, in this case, there's not a lot of time, so it's going to tell very soon. Okay, thank you so much, Jorge. Really appreciate your reporting. Thanks. So, is there any optimism the government can get it right and on time? Cindy Blackstock is Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and she joins me now. Hi, Ms. Blackstock. Great to see you. Good to see you. Thank you very much for coming in. Before I get into the debate over the bill and the content of it, I was hoping that you could help us understand
why a bill like this would be necessary. What problem is it seeking to address?
Well, First Nations children are overrepresented in the child welfare system by 12 times, Vassie, than other kids. And the reason for it is poverty, poor housing, and substance misuse related to multi-generational trauma from residential schools. There are 3 times as many kids in child welfare care than at the height of residential schools right now. And we actually have an opportunity to reverse that over time by addressing those key factors in legislation that ensures that it's culturally based and community driven, and that there's equitable and sustainable funding provided to those children so they have a fair chance to grow up safely in their families. That's really what we want to do, is give them this fair chance on the same kind of opportunities that other Canadian children have, but to grow up at home safely with their families.
Based on what you've heard so far, what you've read so far, are you optimistic that this bill will do that?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I will say that First Nations have been clear for at least 20 years about what we wanted to see in that bill, and that is an affirmation of First Nations jurisdiction and equitable needs-based funding for children. And that's something actually, you probably know, we've been at the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal now for 12 years trying to get federal funding for First Nations child welfare. And we're finally starting to get there for kids. The kids are seeing for the first time since last year an opportunity for prevention services to help their families get healthy so they don't have to go into care. First time in 152 years we're getting that after 12 years of litigation. And we want to make sure that's enshrined in any future legislation because we don't want those hard-won gains for kids to be reversed.
So let me make sure I'm clear. What you mean is that you want the funding, the sort of constant, persistent funding, to be attached to the legislation.
Absolutely, because, if I gave you authority to be able to draw down your own child welfare law, but said there's no money involved in order to do that, that really doesn't allow you to realize that law. These two things go hand in hand. Every time you create a new legislative authority, there has to be the funds in there to make it a reality for citizens on the ground. That's what we're asking for.
What kind of response, I guess, has there been so far? I mean, you point to the 12 years of litigation.
Yeah.
I've interviewed before. I've seen consistent governments fight having to pay what the decision has been, essentially. Is that changing? You mentioned for the first time last year, but do you think that will be part of this bill?
Well, I'm going to expect that as part of the bill. And I think Canadians should expect that too. I mean, there has been such great support of the tribunal's decision since it came down in 2016. And I think disappointment by Canadians that it took 5 non-compliance orders to get Canada to start to move on it. I don't think Canadians are ready to turn back the clock and put kids back in that same discriminatory position that the tribunal found in 2016. I think Canadians are really ready to really make the investments needed to make sure that there is no racial discrimination in the provision of public services for kids, and that the First Nations kids and Métis and Inuit kids get the childhood they deserve.
Are you concerned at all about, I mean, I don't know the exact reasons. We did ask for the minister today, but he was unavailable. I don't know the exact reasons why the delay, why the debate over the content of the bill, but are you worried about, for example, provincial buy-in? We knew there was some resistance when they initially announced they were going to introduce the bill. Are you concerned about sort of the jurisdictional issues and how that may play into the process?
Well, I am concerned about the whole process leading up to it. I mean, the Department of Justice and Indigenous Affairs don't have experts in First Nations child welfare, and they've been the ones drafting it without inviting those people around the drafting table. The provinces really weren't that consulted either. So I think all of us have been kind of surprised by what's been produced and will be surprised about what's tabled. I'm not sure that's the right way of going about this. I mean, I really believe that when you're doing anything for children, you should really have an open process that brings the best thinking and best advice of everyone so we end up with the best decision for kids. I'm a bit concerned about how this is actually all unfolded.
And speaking of unfolding, there is also concern that about when it gets introduced, when it gets passed. We're slowly coming on to, I think, only 12 weeks left of sitting before the House rises in June, and it's an election year.
Right.
Are you worried?
I'm worried about that, and for 2 reasons. One is that there was lots of time to bring this legislation beforehand. I mean, this was a clear priority for First Nations for 20 years. We've actually even, First Nations have drafted their own law to present to government to say, here's a template to work from. So it wasn't as people were sitting around waiting for government to come up with something. There was a good bill there, basis to work on. Now we're in a time crunch. And if this bill is really good and has everything we need, well then good, maybe it has a hope of passing. But if there are concerns, if it lacks those two things, affirmation of First Nations jurisdiction without this kind of purview of the government, federal or provincial over that, and a lack of funding to make it real, then I think I'm going to be really quite concerned. And what we have to make sure, though, is that it doesn't die. That regardless of who comes into power in October, that this has to be one of their priorities. We have to have a generation of First Nations kids that don't have to recover from their childhoods in this country, and we have to have a generation of non-Aboriginal kids who don't have to say they're sorry.
For sure. Thank you so much, Ms.
Thanks for
Blackstock.
coming.
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.